September the 23rd, 1940, northern France. The Wehrmacht corporal's rifle pressed cold against Private Stanley Herbert's spine as mortar fire cracked across the abandoned farmstead. Stanley's hands rose, fingers trembling, watching his 3 remaining squad mates do the same. The reconnaissance patrol had walked straight into a German advance column. No firefight, no heroic last stand. Just 4 exhausted grenadier guards surrendering to 30 enemy soldiers in a mud-churned field 3 kilometers from the Dunkirk perimeter. The evacuation boats had sailed. Stanley Herbert, a 24-year-old clerk from Lewisham, became a prisoner of war before firing a single shot. The German soldiers stripped them of weapons, identification tags, and personal effects within minutes. One guard discovered Stanley's pocket watch, a gift from his father, and pocketed it without a word. Another shoved him into line with rifle butts and guttural commands. The 4 British prisoners marched east under armed escort, joining hundreds of other captured Allied soldiers streaming toward collection points. Stanley's boots, worn through at the heels, rubbed blisters that burst and bled. He stopped thinking about escape after the first hour. The countryside crawled with German troops. Every road, village, and crossroad held enemy positions. Running meant death. 3 days in a cattle car heading east through Belgium and into Germany. 80 men crammed into a space meant for 40. The stench of unwashed bodies and overflowing waste buckets choked the darkness. Stanley stood pressed against wooden slats, legs cramping, unable to sit or lie down. Men urinated where they stood. 2 prisoners collapsed from dehydration before the train crossed the German border. Guards opened the doors twice daily to toss in black bread and pass a single water bucket. At night, temperatures dropped. Stanley shivered in his damp uniform, listening to men weep in the darkness. October 1st, 1940. The train stopped at Lambsdorff, Silesia. Stalag VIII-B sprawled across former Polish military barracks, surrounded by double rows of barbed wire and wooden watchtowers. German guards shouted harsh, clipped commands. Dogs strained against leashes. Stanley shuffled through the gates with 300 other new prisoners, his legs barely supporting him after days in the cattle car. The camp processing stripped away the last remnants of his identity. Guards forced the prisoners to strip naked in the October cold. A Wehrmacht doctor examined each man with mechanical efficiency, checking for disease, cataloguing injuries, and marking those unfit for work. Stanley stood shivering, his ribs already visible beneath pale skin, waiting his turn. The camp stretched beyond sight, row after row of wooden barracks, each designed for 200 men, but housing 400. By autumn 1940, 30,000 Allied prisoners, British, French, Belgian, Polish, were packed into compounds divided by nationality. Stanley received his prisoner number, a thin blanket, and a tin cup. No mattress, no pillow, just wooden boards in a triple-tier bunk system where men slept shoulder to shoulder in the perpetual cold. That first night revealed the camp's true nature. Stanley lay on bare boards in Barrack 14, surrounded by skeletal men who had already survived months of captivity. The barracks reeked of dysentery and rotting feet. Lice crawled through every seam of clothing and blanket, feeding on prisoners too weak to resist. A single wood stove at the barracks centre provided inadequate heat for 400 men. Those nearest the stove sweated, those in the outer bunks froze. Stanley learned quickly that every resource required negotiation, barter, or force. The strong took, the weak starved. The morning appel began at 0500 hours. Guards screamed commands. Prisoners stumbled into formation in the pre-dawn darkness, standing in precise rows while German officers counted and recounted. The October cold bit through Stanley's thin uniform. Men collapsed during roll call. Guards dragged the unconscious aside and continued counting. Appel lasted 2 to 4 hours, depending on failed counts or collective punishments. Stanley's feet went numb, his hands turned blue, He learned to stand absolutely still, eyes forward, breathing shallow, becoming invisible among the identical masses. Breakfast arrived in metal drums, watery soup from potato peelings and barley, sometimes a slice of black bread contaminated with sawdust. The daily ration was roughly 1,200 calories for men working 12-hour labor details. Stanley watched prisoners fight over extra crusts, steal from weaker men, and form alliances for survival. The camp economy ran on Red Cross parcels, cigarettes, and bread. Men traded wedding rings for food, sold family photographs for tobacco, and bartered their souls for another day of life. By the end of his first week, Stanley understood the mathematical certainty of his situation. The Geneva Convention existed on paper. In reality, Stalag VIII-B operated as a slow execution machine. The Germans worked prisoners until they dropped, fed them barely enough to maintain consciousness, and replaced the dead with fresh captures. Escape attempts happened weekly. Guards shot men climbing the wire while search parties hunted down escapees, dragging their bodies back for display at morning appel. Beatings served as public spectacles. A French prisoner caught with contraband maps received 50 lashes in the central yard, while the entire camp was forced to witness or face collective punishment. Stanley observed everything: the guard patterns, the daily routines. The psychological destruction happened incrementally, almost invisibly. He watched a British sergeant captured at Calais deteriorate from defiant soldier to hollow-eyed wraith in 3 weeks. The man stopped eating, stopped speaking, and sat in his bunk staring at nothing until dysentery killed him. Stanley helped carry the body to the camp morgue, a shed where corpses stacked like cordwood awaiting mass burial. The sergeant had simply given up, surrendered to the weight of hopelessness. Others tried to fight. A group of Polish officers spent 2 months digging an elaborate tunnel with stolen spoons and bare hands, disposing of dirt in tiny amounts. German guards discovered the tunnel during a surprise inspection. They forced the conspirators to fill it in themselves, then shipped them to punishment camps further east. Stanley never saw them again. Another attempt involved forged papers to impersonate civilian workers. The escapees made it 3 kilometers before recapture. Guards beat them unconscious in the central yard, leaving them bleeding in the mud as a warning. The camp's medical facilities existed in name only. A converted barracks served as the hospital. German doctors, overworked and understaffed, performed triage based on work capacity. Prisoners too sick to labor received minimal treatment. Those with infectious diseases were quarantined in isolation barracks where mortality rates exceeded 70%. Stanley visited the hospital once to see a fellow grenadier guard with pneumonia. The man lay on a wooden board, covered by a single thin blanket, coughing blood into a rag. No medicine, no treatment, just waiting for death. Stanley left, unable to watch. November brought the first snow. Temperatures plummeted below freezing. The barracks provided no insulation. Prisoners slept in their uniforms, sharing blankets, pressing together for warmth. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Men woke to find bunkmates frozen dead beside them. The camp authorities issued no winter clothing. Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, were pilfered by guards before distribution. A single pair of woolen socks could be traded for a week's worth of bread rations. Stanley worked labor details at a nearby coal mine, 12 hours underground, pushing coal carts through tunnels barely tall enough to stand. The air choked with coal dust. Safety equipment didn't exist. Minor accidents happened daily. Major cave-ins occurred monthly. Supervisors cared nothing for casualties. Dead workers were simply replaced. Stanley's hands bled from handling sharp coal. His lungs burned from the dust. His back ached from constant stooping. He returned to camp each evening, too exhausted to think, too depleted to feel. The psychological warfare proved more devastating than physical brutality. Guards conducted random searches, confiscating letters, destroying photographs, and burning books. They interrupted sleep with midnight inspections, forcing prisoners into the freezing dark for hours-long counts. They withheld mail for months, then delivered it all at once, creating emotional chaos. They promised better conditions and improved rations, then revoked everything without explanation. The inconsistency broke men faster than consistent cruelty. Stanley watched it all with growing understanding. The camp operated on predictable patterns disguised as chaos. Guards followed orders. Doctors followed protocols. The system ran efficiently beneath the surface disorder. Within that system, one category of prisoner received different treatment: the mentally unfit. Insane prisoners were exempted from work details, transferred to special facilities. Sometimes they were repatriated through neutral nations in medical exchanges. The German military had no use for prisoners who had lost their minds. In mid-November, during a brutal 5-hour appel in the sleet, Stanley made his decision. He wasn't strong enough to dig tunnels or climb wire. He couldn't forge papers or speak German. He possessed no special skills or military knowledge for escape, but he understood human psychology, having spent his pre-war life observing people's expectations and biases. And he recognized one universal truth: the insane were invisible, discounted, dismissed, transferred away from the efficient machinery of the camp system. The plan formed with terrible clarity. He would become insane, not through actual mental collapse, but through careful, calculated performance. He would study madness, replicate its symptoms, and convince the German doctors his mind had shattered under captivity. He would make himself useless to the Reich, worthless as a laborer, requiring resources the camp couldn't provide, and then perhaps they would send him away, to a hospital, to a neutral nation, to anywhere but Stalag VIII-B. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant execution. Partial success meant imprisonment in psychiatric facilities, potentially worse than the camp. Failure meant the coal mines, starvation, and eventual death. But staying meant the same end was a certainty, not a possibility. Stanley looked at the skeletal prisoners, the dying men, the broken soldiers who had given up hope. He would not become them. He would not surrender to this place. That night, lying on wooden boards in the freezing barracks, Stanley Herbert began his transformation, not into madness, but into the performance of his life, the role that might grant him freedom or destroy him completely. Private Stanley Herbert understood that maintaining the performance required an absolute commitment to contradictory behaviors no medical manual could reconcile. At 0600 hours on February the 12th, 1942, he executed the next phase of his psychological operation. Standing motionless in the frozen morning roll call yard while temperatures plummeted to -15 degrees Celsius. Fellow prisoners shifted their weight and stamped their feet against the agonizing bite of frostbite, their collective misery a low, shuffling rhythm in the still air. But Herbert remained perfectly still, a statue carved from defiance, eyes fixed on nothing, breath pluming invisible crystalline clouds. When the German medical officer, Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm Schneider, approached with genuine concern about hypothermia, Herbert spoke fluent German, a language he had never before acknowledged understanding, then immediately switched to incomprehensible gibberish, mixing English, German, and invented syllables. Schneider's confusion was palpable. He ordered 2 guards to move Herbert indoors. Herbert walked 3 precise steps, then his legs gave out completely. He collapsed into the snow, a puppet with its strings cut, then stood again without using his hands, resuming his original rigid position as if gravity itself were a temporary inconvenience he had decided to ignore. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. This was not protocol. This was not malingering as they understood it. This was something else entirely, something requiring documentation, observation, and classification. Herbert had achieved his first strategic objective. He was now a medical problem requiring specialized attention and therefore potential transfer away from Stalag VIII-B. The method Herbert employed drew on documented observations from his pre-war work as a psychiatric hospital orderly in Manchester, a detail the Germans never verified because his records listed him simply as a factory worker. He knew that genuine mental illness rarely presented with the dramatic theatrical symptoms popular imagination suggested. Real psychiatric patients displayed patterns. Contradictory, yes, but patterns nonetheless. His genius was to create a pattern so complex it appeared patternless. Symptoms so contradictory they defied diagnosis, yet so sustained they could not be dismissed as simple fakery. He maintained simultaneous symptoms from multiple, incompatible conditions. The rigid catatonia of schizophrenia, the flights of grandiosity from manic episodes, the vivid hallucinations of delirium, and the repetitive compulsions of obsessive disorders. No single diagnosis fit. He had made himself a medical impossibility. Between February and April 1942, Herbert refined his technique with the assistance of 3 fellow prisoners who understood his high-stakes plan. Corporal James Fletcher, a former stage actor from London's West End, coached him on sustaining character without breaking, teaching him breathing techniques to control shivers and tricks to keep his gaze unfocused. Private Thomas Ainsworth, who had trained as a pharmacist before the war, advised him on symptoms that would resist simple chemical testing or rudimentary physical exams. Sergeant Michael Thornton, captured at Dunkirk with medical corps experience, fed him critical information about German psychiatric evaluation procedures, which he gleaned from conversations overheard among the camp medical staff. The 4 men never discussed the plan openly. Fletcher would cough twice when guards approached during their whispered consultations in the latrine. Ainsworth passed notes hidden inside hollowed bread crusts. Thornton sketched diagrams of German medical forms he had glimpsed, indicating exactly which observations triggered transfer protocols. Herbert's symptoms escalated with calculated precision. He began speaking to Captain Morris, an invisible British officer he claimed gave him orders. He would snap to attention mid-conversation, salute empty air, receive inaudible commands, and then execute them with military precision, marching to the corner of the barracks, touching the wall exactly 7 times, and returning to his bunk. When questioned, he became enraged if anyone suggested Captain Morris wasn't real, but remained unnervingly calm when discussing other delusions, creating a disorienting inconsistency within his delusions themselves. He soiled himself publicly, only to then show profound theatrical shame and scrub himself raw in freezing water. The next day, he would defecate deliberately on his bunk with no apparent awareness of wrongdoing. The baffled German doctors documented possible schizophrenia with organic confusion, but noted the presentation was highly atypical. The decisive psychiatric examination occurred on April 23, 1942. Dr. Schneider brought in Oberarzt Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, a renowned specialist from the military hospital in Breslau. Herbert sat across from them in the camp medical office, staring at a point 6 inches to the left of Hoffmann's head. Hoffmann began in German. Herbert didn't respond. Hoffmann tried English. Herbert's eyes tracked slowly toward the doctor, then past him, then back to the original point. Captain Morris says you're lying, Herbert announced in clear, crisp English. He says you're not a doctor. You're a baker. You smell of flour. Hoffmann, a career military psychiatrist with an impassive face, showed no reaction. Who is Captain Morris? He asked calmly. Herbert stood abruptly, walked to the corner, touched the wall 7 times, returned and sat down. The question is improper, he stated in perfect German. Ask correctly, Hoffmann rephrased. Where is Captain Morris? Herbert smiled, a chillingly lucid expression. He's standing behind you. He's laughing because you can't see him. Then his expression changed entirely, becoming blank, confused and frightened. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why am I here?" Hoffman leaned forward, sensing a breakthrough. Before he could speak, Herbert snapped back to rigid attention, saluting the empty space beside the doctor. "Sir, yes, sir. I'll tell them nothing, sir." The examination lasted 90 minutes. Hoffman wrote extensively in his notes, his pen scratching furiously, before consulting quietly and at length with Schneider. May 1942 brought the crisis Herbert had both orchestrated and feared. The Germans decided to test his condition with extreme measures. They moved him to an isolation cell. No furniture, no blanket, a bare concrete floor, and a single observation slot in the door. The strategy was documented in Wehrmacht medical protocols. Genuine psychotics showed consistent symptoms regardless of environment, while malingerers broke character when comfort was removed and observation reduced. Fletcher had warned him this was coming. When the heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound booming in the tiny space, Herbert was truly alone. The cell measured 2 meters by 3. At night, the temperature dropped below freezing, the cold radiating from the concrete, a constant invasive presence. Guards observed through the slot every hour, their fleeting eyes the only proof he was not in his own tomb. Herbert now had to maintain his performance with no audience validation, no sympathetic glances, no breaks, no rest. He stood in the center of the cell for 16 hours a day, speaking to Captain Morris in whispers the guards documented but couldn't fully hear. He touched the walls in ritualistic patterns. He urinated in the corner, then became distressed and tried to clean it with his bare hands. When guards brought thin soup and bread, he refused it one day, consumed it ravenously the next, and threw it against the wall on the third. Each action was documented. Each notation went into his medical file. 14 days into isolation, Herbert began to break. Not the character, his own mind. The relentless cold was destroying his feet. Early frostbite blackened 3 toes. He couldn't feel his left foot at all. The isolation was genuine psychological torture, a void he was forced to populate with his own fictions. He had prepared for physical hardship, but the sensory deprivation and the endless internal performance with no validation of whether it was working caused his mind to generate actual symptoms. He started seeing things that weren't part of his act. Shadows coalesced into hunched figures that dissolved when he stared. He heard whispers that weren't Captain Morris's voice, faint and critical, in an old, familiar Manchester accent. His hands, which he needed to hold steady for his catatonic poses, now shook with a tremor that was not feigned. Was this hypothermia, starvation, or was he actually losing his mind in the process of pretending to lose it? The line between the performance and the performer was dissolving in the freezing dark. On June 3, 1942, a Wehrmacht administrative officer, Major Klaus Reinhardt, arrived at Stalag VIII-B to conduct medical transfer evaluations. He read Herbert's file with professional detachment. 17 weeks of consistent symptom presentation, he noted aloud. No pattern deterioration, no character breaks, multiple observation protocols. Isolation test results inconclusive. Patient maintained symptoms but developed possible organic complications. He ordered Herbert brought before him. The guards carried Herbert from the cell. He couldn't walk. His feet were damaged. His weight had dropped from 68 kilograms to 53. His eyes were sunken holes in a gaunt face. But when he saw Reinhardt's uniform, training took over. He struggled to attention, saluted the empty air, and said clearly, "Captain Morris says to inform you the war will end on a Tuesday in May." Then he collapsed. Reinhardt made his decision at once. Whether Herbert was genuinely insane or the most committed malingerer he had ever encountered was medically irrelevant. The man required specialized psychiatric care, or he would die in Stalag VIII-B. "Transfer approved to Reserve Lazarette Kloster Hadamar," Reinhardt wrote. Then he paused, his pen hovering. Hadamar was a known euthanasia center where the Nazi regime eliminated the mentally unfit. It was a place of SS doctors and murder, not Wehrmacht treatment. A flash of professional disgust, or perhaps a flicker of conscience, crossed Reinhardt's face. This prisoner was a soldier. He struck through the name with a single decisive line, writing instead, Kriegsgefangenen Lazarett Elsterhorst. The POW hospital at Elsterhorst treated psychiatric cases but maintained Geneva Convention protections. It was also, he noted absently, only 80 kilometers from the Swiss border. Herbert regained consciousness in the back of a transport truck 3 days later. A single older Wehrmacht guard named Dietrich accompanied him and 2 other prisoners genuinely ill with tuberculosis. As the truck rolled west through occupied Poland and into Germany, Herbert maintained his performance, speaking to Captain Morris and touching surfaces in patterns. But his mind was calculating distances, border crossings, geography. He now faced the impossible question. Elsterhorst was still a German POW hospital, still behind wire. The Swiss border was 80 kilometers through hostile territory, and he had no papers, no civilian clothes, and damaged feet. His body was weakened, his mind genuinely unstable from the isolation. The truck stopped at a checkpoint outside Dresden. A young Gestapo officer boarded, his black uniform radiating menace. He looked at Herbert, who was rocking and whispering. "What's wrong with this one?" he asked Dietrich. "Verrückt," Dietrich replied. "Crazy." The Gestapo officer's eyes narrowed. He leaned close to Herbert. "Are you faking, Englander?" he asked in accented English. Herbert stopped rocking. He looked directly at the man, the first direct eye contact he had made in months. He smiled. "Captain Morris says you should check your left pocket," he said calmly. The officer reflexively touched his pocket. Herbert's smile widened. "He's never wrong." The officer found nothing, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. He stepped back. "Continue," he told Dietrich, then departed. Dietrich watched Herbert with new wariness. That had been a profound mistake, Herbert realized, as cold dread washed over him, too coherent, too clever. In one moment of arrogant defiance, he had broken character and gifted the Gestapo perfect evidence against him. Panic coiled in his gut. If that officer filed a report, if that suspicion reached Elsterhorst, the entire operation would collapse. The truck lurched forward into the German darkness, and Herbert immediately resumed rocking, his whispers to Captain Morris now a desperate prayer. Behind the facade of madness, his rational mind raced through impossible calculations. The border was 80 kilometers away, his feet were damaged, the guards would be watching, and somehow, in his performance of insanity, he had to find the clarity to plan an escape that no sane man would ever attempt. The Scottish Military Psychiatric Hospital at Bangor, near Edinburgh, was a place accustomed to the invisible wounds of war. It received Private Stanley Herbert with practiced, almost weary efficiency in late October 1943. He arrived not merely as another soldier, but as a complex puzzle, accompanied by a German medical file 3 inches thick. This dossier meticulously documented 18 months of observed psychotic episodes, terrifying violent outbursts, and a profound, seemingly complete disassociation from reality. The British doctors on staff, professionals trained to spot the subtle tells of malingerers attempting to avoid duty, approached him with a deeply ingrained and necessary skepticism. Yet for 11 days on British soil, Stanley Herbert maintained his flawless performance. On November 3rd, during a routine morning examination, he finally broke character. He looked directly at the ward psychiatrist Major Ronald Campbell and asked a simple yet world-altering question that would begin his slow, meticulous revelation. How long must a man pretend before he can stop? The question hung in the sterile air of the examination room. a direct challenge to the entire narrative contained within the thick file on Campbell's desk. The careful unmasking of his deception was not an immediate event. It took 3 painstaking months. Herbert couldn't simply announce his sanity and expect immediate belief. His German file was too convincing, his recorded symptoms too severe and well documented. British military psychiatry in 1943 had seen countless soldiers attempting to feign mental illness to escape the horrors of combat. Herbert's case required extraordinary, irrefutable proof that he had been sane throughout his entire captivity, that every documented episode had been a piece of deliberate, high-stakes theatre, and most importantly, that he could now be trusted for future military service. He revealed his method incrementally, first in hushed private sessions to Major Campbell alone, who listened with a mixture of professional doubt and growing fascination. Then, more formally, he faced a board of 3 senior psychiatrists in December 1943, men whose careers were built on unmasking deception. He detailed the exact symptoms he had chosen to mimic, explaining his strategic selection of a schizophrenic presentation because it required no physical markers, only absolute behavioral consistency. He described the period of intense study at Stalag VIII-B before his transfer to the lazaret, where he had obsessively observed a genuinely ill fellow prisoner, memorizing the man's disjointed movements, his fractured speech patterns, and the particular vacant, you-haunted quality of his stare. To prove his point, Herbert demonstrated his technique, switching between his insane persona and his normal, articulate self with a precision that the medical board found profoundly disturbing. This level of conscious control over presentation suggested either a genuine and exceptionally rare dissociative disorder, or more astonishingly, an extraordinary and unprecedented psychological discipline. He explained his cold logic. Physical escape from Stalag VIII-B was impossible for him. His recapture from a failed tunnel attempt in early 1942 had resulted in a badly crushed foot, leaving him with a permanent, pronounced limp that precluded any chance of a successful run. Medical repatriation, therefore, offered the only viable, albeit perilous, route home. The German doctor's reports, once translated completely, became his greatest asset. They revealed details Herbert himself had forgotten, incidents of erratic behavior witnessed by guards through peepholes, documented symptoms observed during moments when he believed himself entirely unmonitored. This external corroboration, provided unwittingly by his captors, proved his performance had been total, unceasing, and utterly convincing. By February 1944, the British Medical Board reached its unanimous conclusion: Private Stanley Herbert was mentally sound and had successfully executed one of the most elaborate and sustained psychological deceptions in the history of prisoners of war. He was officially declared fit for service and discharged from psychiatric observation on February 18, 1944. His medical file was annotated with a special classification that would remain restricted for 30 years. Deliberate simulation for repatriation purposes, performance sustained under enemy observation for 18 months, mental fortitude exceptional, recommend for intelligence evaluation. The immediate question facing British military authorities was what to do with such a man. Herbert's injured foot precluded frontline infantry service, but his demonstrated ability to sustain deep cover and withstand immense psychological pressure made him an asset of unique value for intelligence work. MI9, the directorate responsible for escape and evasion, interviewed him extensively in March 1944. His debriefing provided astonishingly detailed information about German medical repatriation procedures, the specific criteria their doctors used to evaluate mental illness, and crucially, the weaknesses in their observation protocols. This intelligence, a direct result of his 18-month immersive performance, informed new guidance given to other POWs through intricately coded messages hidden in Red Cross parcels. While the specifics of Herbert's masterclass in feigned insanity were never explicitly shared, teaching mass malingering would violate the very Geneva Convention protections that benefited genuine British POWs. The general insights into German diagnostic weaknesses were invaluable. Herbert, however, declined recruitment into SOE or MI9 field operations. His 18 months of constant draining performance had exhausted him psychologically in ways he struggled to articulate. Instead, he accepted a quiet posting to the War Office in London, working in a clerical capacity processing repatriation paperwork until VE Day. This position kept him in military service while allowing him the space to recover from his unique and solitary ordeal. To his fellow repatriated POWs from the October 1943 exchange, he remained a tragic case of a broken mind, and Herbert maintained a careful distance from POW reunions for years afterward, deeply uncomfortable with the necessary continuation of the lie among his own comrades. The two German doctors who had certified Herbert's insanity, Oberarzt Klaus Hoffmann and Stabsarzt Friedrich Weber, were interviewed during post-war Allied investigations into POW camp medical practices. Neither faced war crimes charges. Their treatment of Herbert, ironically, had been professionally appropriate and compassionate for a genuinely mentally ill patient. When informed of Herbert's deception during 1946 interrogations, Hoffmann's response was one of pure disbelief. Recorded verbatim, "Impossible. I observed this man for 14 months. No one can maintain such a performance." Weber, more pragmatically, requested to see Herbert's British psychiatric discharge papers before he would accept the truth. Both German doctors' professional reputations suffered internally from the revelation, used by Allied investigators as a stark example of inadequate Axis medical screening protocols. Herbert himself provided testimony in 1947, clarifying that both men had been competent physicians deceived by an exceptional performance, not collaborators in a scheme. Herbert married in 1946 to a Scottish nurse named Margaret Dalrymple, who had treated him briefly at Bangor. They moved to Dumfries, where Herbert took a position with the local council as a housing administrator. He deliberately chose a life of profound obscurity, settling into the routines of civilian life with an intensity that spoke not of boredom, but of profound relief. He attended no military ceremonies, politely declined interviews from early POW historians, and never once sought to contact his former fellow prisoners. His war service record was marked exemplary, but contained no specific citations or medals. The very nature of his escape made official recognition complicated. Publicly honoring a man for faking mental illness, even ingeniously, posed uncomfortable questions about other repatriated POWs and could be seen as encouraging malingering in future conflicts. Margaret Herbert later recalled that her husband would occasionally, usually after a whiskey, demonstrate his camp face, the vacant stare and slight twitching movements he had perfected. She found it deeply unsettling, a chilling glimpse into the immense psychological toll of his performance. Herbert himself admitted in private conversations that the hardest part wasn't fooling the Germans, but the constant gnawing fear that he might lose track of where the performance ended and genuine psychological damage began. For 3 decades, Herbert's story remained buried in restricted military files. The first public mention came in 1973, when historian David Rolfe's Prisoners of the Reich briefly referenced a British private who successfully feigned insanity for repatriation without naming Herbert. The full, detailed account emerged only in 1982, when Herbert, then 71 years old and in failing health, authorized the release of his military medical records and wrote his memoir. The title, POW, the First Lady of the Great Escapers, was Herbert's own mordant joke. His psychological escape had required none of the tunneling, forging, or communal physical courage celebrated in other more famous accounts. His escape was cerebral, utterly solitary, and impossible to share with fellow prisoners. The manuscript, completed in 18 months, detailed his methodology with chilling clinical precision. He explained how he had carefully rationed his performance, fully aware that symptoms deemed too severe might result in his inclusion in German euthanasia programs against the mentally ill, while symptoms too mild wouldn't warrant repatriation. He described the profound isolation of his deception, unable to confide in anyone, maintaining the act even when alone in his cell because guards constantly monitored him through observation slots. He devoted an entire chapter to the crushing ethical weight of his decision, acknowledging that he had occupied a repatriation slot that might have gone to a genuinely ill or wounded prisoner. He concluded, with the cold logic that had saved him, that his sworn duty to escape superseded his personal guilt, but he admitted that the guilt remained a constant, low-level hum for the rest of his life. Publication came in 1984. 2 years after Herbert's death from pneumonia on March 15, 1982. The book sold modestly, reviewed respectfully in military history journals, but never achieving popular success. It was too cerebral, too uncomfortable. Readers wanted tales of physical daring and camaraderie, not the solitary psychological endurance of a man who escaped by convincing his captors he had broken. The definitive assessment of Herbert's case came from the British Army School of Military Intelligence at Ashford, which incorporated his account into psychological operations training in 1985. His memoir became required reading for interrogation resistance courses, analyzed not as an escape story, but as an unparalleled case study in sustained deception under continuous hostile observation. The specific techniques Herbert used, establishing a baseline of abnormal behavior, maintaining absolute consistency across multiple observers, and creating symptoms that required subjective interpretation rather than objective measurement, informed training given to personnel at high risk of capture. Modern SEER instructors reference Herbert's 18-month performance as the longest documented case of successful sustained deception in POW history, though they emphasize the immense psychological cost and discourage imitation except in extremis. Herbert's method worked because of a unique confluence of circumstances: German adherence to Geneva Convention medical repatriation, his own extraordinary psychological resilience, and the state of 1940s psychiatric diagnosis. Military historians have since noted that Herbert's psychological escape required a greater, more sustained form of courage than many celebrated physical escapes. A tunnel digger could rest, could drop his guard with fellow conspirators, could abandon the attempt if the cost became unbearable. Herbert had no respite for 18 months, no confidants, and no ability to quit once he had begun. The mental discipline required to maintain absolute consistency while isolated in a German psychiatric ward, knowing that a single lapse would mean a return to the main camp and likely execution for deceiving his captors, represented human willpower operating at its uttermost limit. The Imperial War Museum added Herbert's German medical file and British psychiatric discharge papers to their collection in 1989, donated by Margaret Herbert. A single, modest display case in the museum's sprawling POW section commemorates his story, titled simply Psychological Escape. Visitors, often in a hurry, pass it quickly, their eyes drawn instead to the more dramatic exhibits of makeshift tunnel-digging tools and coded letters. But those who pause to read Herbert's account find themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about sanity, performance, and the invisible line between conscious deception and genuine psychological dissolution. Stanley Herbert's war was fought entirely in his own mind, against his own capacity for despair, maintaining a performance so complete that even trained psychiatrists couldn't detect the deception. He returned home not through wire cutting or compass navigation, but through sheer, sustained will, convincing his enemies that he had lost the very thing he was so desperately preserving, his sanity. His unique legacy endures in restricted training programs and classified psychological operations manuals, a name known to specialists but deliberately forgotten by popular history. This was perhaps precisely the fate Herbert himself chose for his quiet, hard-won post-war life. The man who escaped by masterfully pretending to lose his mind spent the rest of his freedom ensuring he would not be easily remembered, his final successful act of control after nearly 2 years of relentless, terrifying performance.